So you're doing the live streaming?
Yes.
Yes, so I'll be standing. I'll basically be standing here and talking, here from the microphone. The other way around?
Not even look into that.
Oh, this is fine.
Yeah, the only problem is that the text is coming flipped.
Oh, right on
because of the mirror image.
Yeah. Yeah, that should be fine because there's only. Let me take a look. I think this is the only slide with text on. The other slides are just images.
Oh.
And so.
Okay.
But still, it will be.
No, the rest of them are images.
So it looks like this. So, I mean, the name can be flipped. You're going to see.
Yeah, because on laptops, you don't have the flip camera.
Okay.
Like on the phone, you have a front and a back camera. The laptop, you only have a front camera. The front camera takes a mirror.
So this is the only slide that you have here? Yeah, let me check the other slides. I think that's the only one. The angle good? Shall we?
It's totally up to you.
Okay, let's move further. I mean, move the table further. As long as it doesn't inter.
Well, the thing is this, we need to show the presenter.
No, but that's it. So like if you look at these slides, most of them are just. I mean, there may be a little bit of caption there, but it's really just more the image. That's the only slide that has any significant amount of text.
Would it be possible for you to say the caption?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, that's fine. Why don't we just put it straight? I mean, you want to have the
for
the speakers also,
right? Or because I don't want to come in that way. Because the thing is this, that let me try putting it here.
What if you put the?
What about this one?
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah, I think it's better.
Because that covers it for you.
Yeah.
And they also said that. If I look anywhere else, I will come in the line of projection.
And then it will,
Right.
If we put it here, then wouldn't it?
If I put it somewhere over here.
And then I was thinking.
You can leave it over there.
Actually, because he has to see this.
Because if that laptop comes, let's.
That's blocking the projector. Oh, you're blocking the projector. This one.
See, that's why.
How about here, somewhere here? So. Much better, isn't it?
What's fine for me, yeah, it's just
I think the closer is better.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah, it has the screen, it has the speakers. It's good.
Yeah, because it's all the information from microphone.
the screen up a little bit. So when you move it, it's not up to the.
Oh, like this one, man, it doesn't stay, and I don't want to ruin it.
So what is it that you want to do?
It's so we just want to take it down a little bit.
It's fine like that.
You sure?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's fine. So, yeah, but all of them. Like I said,
My pleasure.
Yeah, sure. Let's see.
We'll sit over here. There's nothing. It's hard.
I saw your assignment. Did you review one? All right. Good evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Shalom alaikum and peace be with you all. My name is Fatih Harchi. I'm a professor of religion at Carthage College. Do not worry, I am not the speaker. Welcome to the second lecture of the Kenosha Interfaith Scholar in the Residence Program. We are live streaming the event, just so you know. This event series is dedicated to the late Rabbi Michael Ramson, who was the co-founder of the Kenosha Interfaith Scholar in Residence initiative and the program years ago. And we will be having Professor Amir Hussain as the Kenosha 2022 Kenosha Interfaith Scholar in Residence. He gave a fabulous lecture last night at Carthage College on anti-racism and Muslim Americans. Tonight he will be speaking about the Muslims and media images. Tomorrow he will be at the Beth Hillel Temple speaking about the Muslims and Jewish relations. And on Sunday, he will be talking about Muslims and Christians, Muslim-Christian relations at the First United Methodist Church. Okay. Did I say I wasn't the speaker? Okay. So Professor Amir Hussain, he is the chair and professor of theological studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. He teaches courses on Islam, comparative religion. He teaches courses on religion and film, as you will see tonight. He is the president-elect of the AAR, American Academy of Religion. He has published books, and he was the advisor for the television series The Story of God with Morgan Freeman. The book that I can personally suggest is the Oil and Water, that I read, that I fell in love, that I admire still. Oil and Water, Two Faiths, One God. And there is another book, and this other book will be available for signing, The Muslims and the Making of America. So he will be signing his books for those who are interested in. What else? I think I covered everything. All right, so please give a warm welcome to Dr. Amir Hussain.
Good evening, Shabbat Shalom, Assalamu Alaikum. Thanks to Taki for that kind introduction. If you can't hear me, just let me know. Delighted to be here as the Kenosha Interfaith Scholar. And so again, thanks to Taki, to the committee that's here. Pastor Kara is here, Pastor Susan, Rabbi Dana, and then thanks to the Muslim community, Imam Ilyas, President Sheikh, for hosting us here in this Islamic Center. And thanks, of course, to all of you who are here with us tonight. Let me start with a little bit of background information about me, not because I think I'm particularly important, but to give a sense of where we began with representations of Muslims on film and television. I want to provide a little bit of qualitative information to provide some background, some context. In 1970, when I was 4 years old, I left Pakistan with my parents and came to Canada. At that time in 1970, there were fewer than 34,000 Muslims in all of Canada. Some 50 years later, the 2011 National Household Survey counted over 1 million Canadian Muslims. While the population of Muslims grew tremendously, we were almost absent from the array of characters portrayed on screen and television. When I was a child, Haji from reruns of the animated show Johnny Quest was the only Muslim I could identify on television. Added bonus, he was also a fellow East Indian, as we South Asians were then called in the 1970s. But I was puzzled how a child could have made the pilgrimage to Mecca and earned the title of Haji. I spoke Urdu and Punjabi, those are my native languages in Pakistan. I had no idea what his magic word Sim Sim Salabim meant. Do what you do. There was an Arab character, Corporal Max Klinger, played by Jamie Farr from MASH. But in the show, of course, those that know the show, he was a Lebanese Christian, not a Muslim. He also spent much of the series in drag, trying to get out of the army. this portion of unusual, let's say, Arab characters would continue with Tony Shalhoub's brilliant title character of Adrian Monk in Monk. You can see the real OCD, the obsessive compulsive detective. So he's got an obsessive compulsive disorder. Interestingly, most of the Arabs on television and Casey Kasem on the radio were Arab Christians, not Muslims. Perhaps reflecting the fact that half of the Arabs in this country are in fact Christians, not Muslim. In 1977, I stayed up to watch Roots, a miniseries, telling Alex Haley's story, and was delighted to learn that Kunta Kinte, played by LeVar Burton, was a Muslim. That's extraordinary, because you think about the history of Islam in this country. My book that Fatih mentioned, available for sale at the end of this talk. It's a wonderful Purim gift, Lenten gift, Ramadan's coming up, Saka. The book begins with this deliberately provocative sentence: there's never been an America without Islam. Because our roots go back to the transatlantic slave trade. The first Muslim we can document that came to what is now this country is Estebanico the Moor, brought by one of the Spanish conquistadors in 1528. If you look at the slave trade, we estimate that about 10% of the slaves who were brought over from West Africa were Muslim. I had no idea about that until I watched Roots there. I knew about African American athletes who had converted to Islam. Muhammad Ali, who came to Sunni Islam through the Nation of Islam. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who came straight into Sunni Islam. I talked about this yesterday at the talk at Carthage, that if you haven't seen it, watch the Ken Burns documentary about Muhammad Ali, because it really talks about some of his social justice kinds of issues. We forget Ali's role in the 60s in civil rights. In 1978, I came to admire the character of Venus Flytrap, played by Kim Reed, on WKRP in Cincinnati, one of the great sort of comedy shows. In one episode of the final season, a detective who's about to arrest him, asked him if he's a Muslim. So it's really interesting kind of thing, the connection with Black folks and Islam. Since the time of my youth, while the Muslim population has increased tremendously, as I said, we know the count of Muslims in Canada because we asked it on the Canadian survey. It's well over 1 million Muslims in Canada. We don't know the exact number of Muslims here because we don't ask that question on the short form of the survey. I've seen estimates that as low as 2.5 million, which I think is way too low. I've seen estimates as high as like 10 million, which I think is way too high. I'm comfortable with about 6 million American Muslims. So, that shift in Canada, 34,000 Muslims when I came, over 1 million Muslims now. The number of Muslim characters on television and film has remained negligible. And the few that exist are often, unfortunately, of alien, violent men. No surprise that we have some of the stereotypes that we do of Islam. So in this talk, I just briefly want to describe, analyze the portrayal of Muslims in the past 20 years. And I argue that in the early part of this century, Muslims were usually not recognized on American television as ordinary citizens of their country, but instead were portrayed as dangerous immigrants with a religion that is both alien and evil. Moreover, their lived religion consisted solely of expressions of violence. There seems to be no other substantive practice that embodies the Islamic faith on film and television. But I then want to move to discuss how these images have changed in the last few years, often with the help of Muslims involved in their production. And I note here that I'm talking about television, including the newer platforms like Hulu, Netflix, Disney Plus, Amazon, saying nothing of the older platforms like cable television, blurring the line in film. I teach a religion film class, but that line is blurred now. We talk about television, we talk about film. 2017, I think about 5 years ago, particularly special year. Mahershala Ali winning the first Academy Award for Moonlight, Kumail Nanjiani with the summer's hot romantic comedy, The Big Sick, Hassan Minhaj, Homecoming King, Aziz Ansari winning, I think, 4 Emmys for Master of None. A decade before that in Canada,
Zarq bin Awaz created Little Mosque on the Prairie. And on a smaller side, I'll conclude the talk with this. As a Muslim scholar of Islam, I've been involved in some television shows. Saving Grace with Holly Hunter, The Story of God that Fatih mentioned with Morgan Freeman. And I think in this way, it's Muslims who are changing the images of Muslims on film and television. It'd be difficult, I think, to overstate the role of the media in forming impressions of Islam and Muslims here in the United States. The importance of the news media became important to me through my courses on Islam. I came to California in 1997. I taught for 8 years at Cal State Northridge. In the 4 years before the terrorist attacks of 9/11, I began with a standard historical introduction to Islam in my Islam course. Frank Peters' wonderful book, Muhammad and the Origins of Islam. Really good critical historical look at the Prophet Muhammad and the beginnings of Islam. I did that because my students, whether they were Muslim or not, often knew very little about Islam. After 9/11, I found that this book was no longer effective because students had a great deal of knowledge about Islam and the religious lives of Muslims, except that almost all their knowledge came from the popular media and was at complete odds with the ways in which Muslims understand our own faith. As a result, after 9/11, I started using Neil Postman and Steve Powers' How to Watch TV News, a wonderful book that describes how television news works, where ratings and profit are more important than awards for investigative journalism. When what matters is ratings, the controversial, the provocative, are privileged over the thoughtful and the accurate. News directors are hired and fired, not on how well they do their jobs, but how well they sell the commercials, how many people watch. So I alternate between that book, How to Watch TV News, and Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. It's the first book in every Islam class I teach. It now becomes a media literacy class for the first couple of weeks before we even get to talk about Islam. This is not new. August of 2007, the Pew Research Forum on Religion and Public Life indicated that about 58% of Americans said they knew not very much or nothing about Islam. 70% of Islam was very different from their own religion. Think about that for a second. When you're asked, what do you know about Islam? And you answer not very much or nothing, 58%. But 70% can say it's different from their own religion. How do you do that if you don't know, what the religion is? 35% held unfavorable opinions about Muslims. The only group to rate lower than American Muslims in terms of friendliness were atheists, who were unfavorable to 53% of those surveyed. 55% of people thought that Muslims were unfavorable. 10 years later, in 2017, the same Pew Forum found that half of Americans, fully got 50%, did not think of Islam as part of mainstream society. And so representations of Muslims have to play into this. Representations on commercial television are no better than those in news media. When I ask my students about images of Muslims on television, they're initially stumped. After some time, a student usually comes up with the cartoon character of Apu from The Simpsons, but it's quickly corrected by their students, say, no. Apu is a Hindu. He's not a Muslim. A loyal Simpsons viewer might recognize there was a Muslim character, Bashir bin Laden, on the My Positive Group 6 episode in the 20th season, 2008. Dave Chappelle, perhaps the most famous, Muslim comedian. Yet only a few students know that Dave Chappelle is a Muslim. None of the major characters on Chappelle Show, it's a groundbreaking show on television, were Muslim. Eventually, some of my students will recall the character of Syed Jarrah, played by Naveen Andrews on ABC's Lost, or Imam Karim Saeed, the first regular Muslim character on television from Tom Fontana's crime show Oz on HBO. Remember this? before The Sopranos on HBO. The first regular drama was Oz, about prison. Tom Fontana did cop shows, homicide, life on the street. I remember interviewing Tom years ago for a project I was doing, and I asked him when he came to do the show at prison. He said, well, I do cop shows. And at the end of the cop show, the bad guy goes to jail. And so I was thinking, okay, what happens when the bad guy goes to jail? What happens about jail? If I'm going to write, speaking as Tom Montana, if I'm going to write about jails, I talk about the gangs, Indians, Aryan Nation, Mexican Mafia, Black Muslims. And you have Eamon Walker, this British guy, playing the first regular Muslim character on American TV. Others mentioned characters from Showtime Sleeper Cell, I'll talk about that in a second. A few cite professional wrestlers. Here's my true confession. I grew up working class, so my theater, my opera, my mythological stage for the Battle of Good and Evil, which you guessed it, pro wrestling. I am a pro wrestling fan. I'm not ashamed to admit it. But you think of the characters, the Sheik, Abdullah the Butcher, nicknamed the Madman from Sudan, the Iron Sheik, who initially started off as Hussein the Arab before the Persian conflict, and then all of a sudden he became Iranian. It's this really fascinating kind of thing there. Sabu, Muhammad Hassan. So if you look at Muslims on TV, terrorists, prisoners, enemy combatants, bad guy wrestlers, they don't reflect the realities of American Muslim life. Many North American Muslims be marginalized by their race, as well as by their religion. A quarter of us are African American. A third of us are people like me, American Muslims, South Asians, people from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. A third are Middle Eastern folks, but that could mean Arab, it could mean Iranian, it could mean Turkish, increasingly post 9/11 subject to religious profiling. With the presidency of Donald Trump, it's even more difficult to be an American Muslim. This was then candidate Trump, on the famous interview with Anderson Cooper saying, I think Islam hates us. Friday, January 27th, 2017, a week after his inauguration, President Trump ordered that the United States ban travelers and refugees from 7 Muslim-majority countries. Did this in the afternoon after making comments that morning for International Holocaust Remembrance Day that made no mention of Jews or anti-Semitism. Thousands of people protested across airports across the country in the following days. This is from one of those, you can't make this up kind of moment. I was flying to Washington, D.C. on that Friday, January 27th. I disclosed this the other day. The other thing about me that you will find shocking and amazing is I'm the last human being with a cell phone. I don't own a cell phone. I never owned a cell phone. So I get up in the air, January, it's like a 1 o'clock flight. The world is normal. I land on the Friday, go to my hotel room in DC, open up my email. I have 338 emails since the flight has taken off. And that's because of the travel ban. And again, this is literally from, you cannot make this stuff up. I'm in DC to talk with law enforcement officials, specifically FBI, about Muslims, to help law enforcement with Islam and Muslims. And so when I go into my talk on Saturday, my first words to the guys there were like, could you not have given me a heads up? Could you have told me that this was going to happen? They're like, oh, we didn't know it was going to happen. I'm like, oh, that's not good. If you didn't know this was going to happen. But, you look at this, and I flew back on the Sunday from DC to Los Angeles, and you saw these protests, extraordinarily powerful. And I spoke about this the other day, that, it really was the Jewish community that took the lead in this, standing up for Muslims, standing up for refugees, standing up for immigrants. The Jewish community has been at the forefront of those protests, both because they know, and I'm sorry to say for the rabbi, I'm not trying to teach Torah in front of a rabbi, I don't have that chutzpah, but you know that the commandment that is repeated more times than any other commandment in the Torah is not to oppress the stranger. And of course, because Jews know the painful history of the Holocaust and where the road of prejudice and intolerance ends. And with the rise against hate crimes, I always have to say this to my students, over half of the hate crimes committed against a religious group in America are not committed against Muslims, they're committed against Jews. That's where the Muslim community, the Jewish community really need to stand and work together. I'll talk more about that tomorrow. Let me come back to the portrayals of Muslims on television. You see the same thing with Muslims on film in the 20th century. Film depictions of Arabs and Muslims representing bloodthirsty men, exotic, oversexed women. I write in the book about the very first film shot on location in Los Angeles, about 114 years ago, Francis Boggs, in The Power of the Sultan, about, you guessed it, a Turkish sultan in his evil ways. Classic study of Arabs in Hollywood films is Jack Shaheen, Real Bad Arabs. And Shaheen describes over 900 films where Arabs are portrayed, and he describes, I'm quoting from Jack's work, the image of Arabs as a systematic, pervasive, unapologetic degradation and dehumanization of people. In 2006, a one-hour documentary film, Real Bad Arabs, was made on the book. This trend about negative images of Arabs only intensified after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the standard archetype of the bad guy shifted from being a communist to being an Arab. Television drama, which is obviously fictional, designed to entertain. It's important to understand, though, what's allowed, what's permitted there. Many dramas often tell stories ripped from the headlines. Many dramas borrow real events, individuals. So, for example, A Sleeper Cell. Showtime did this in a really interesting way as a way of talking about this homegrown terror song. You can see the tagline: friends, neighbors, husbands, terrorists. The show ran for 2 seasons on Sleeper Cell, and some things to admire. Michael Ealy on the top, who plays like a Muslim agent who infiltrates this sleeper cell. He's one of the good guys. And yet even there, he's caught up in that cycle of violence and revenge. Muslims who are terrorists. And what's fascinating was, this is this great scene shot in Wilshire Boulevard Temple, where the head terrorist actually Oded Fear, an Israeli actor. And there's a great scene. If we had time, I'd show you this clip, where they're in the synagogue, and Michael Ealy is playing, this guy who's trying to infiltrate this terrorist organization, and Oded says to him, get that thing off your head. Well, he's wearing a kippah. This idea that, what kind of head covering is acceptable, what kind of head covering isn't, acceptable there. And it's sort of interesting that, I remember years ago doing a panel at the University of Southern California, where Kamran Pasha, one of the few Muslims working in the industry, talked about how he saw immigrants being portrayed in several stages on television and film. First as objects of fear, to induce fear. Then in comedy, to be made fun of. Then finally in drama. I think we're still in that first stage. Muslims as objects to induce fear. But it is changing a little bit with comedies. And I really love the kind of work that's been happening in the last little bit on television with this. There was this wonderful comedy in 2007 that you might remember called Aliens in America. High school student actually set here in Wisconsin, whose parents arranged for an exchange student to come stay with the family. They think they're getting some Norwegian guy. They get Raja Musharraf from Pakistan, played by Derek Kalyan, who speaks with an Indian accent, wears traditional Al-Shawar kameez. And it's that sympathetic portrayal, trying to fit in a different culture. It's a perfect example for high school life. How do you try to fit in? How do you accommodate? It was a wonderful show, but it only lasted for a year. What's been fascinating is you look at who gets cast. And so you may not remember this show, but if you watch CBS, you might know this show, United States of A. It's the same actor, Adrian Monk, who plays the same, now he plays an Iraqi in this episode. So just really fascinating here. If you watched NBC Community, this great comedy that ran for 6 seasons, a movie's been rumored to be in the works for 10 years, one of the students, played by Danny Pudi, is supposed to be Muslim. It's set in a fictional community college. I love that. If you're doing a show about universities, have some Muslim students, because guess what? There's some Muslim students at colleges and universities. In the show, and again, it's funny, I think he actually intentionally play on this. Danny Pudi, who's there on the right, plays a character named Abed Nadir, who has a Palestinian father in the show and a Polish mother. Perhaps not Danny Pudi, who actually has an Indian father and a Polish mother. Danny's one of the few Indians I know who swears in Polish. In the first season, they had this episode called Basic Genealogy, where Abed's cousin comes to visit, clad in full niqab. And there's some really interesting references. Like there's, I think, 3 episodes out of 6 seasons that are explicitly about Islam and Muslims. And I love that, because his being a Muslim is sort of incidental. He happens to be a Muslim, just like one of the other characters happens to be a Christian. But it's not about their Islam and their Christianity, it's about how they function in this community college here. I do love the fact that, Danny Pudi, Abed's father, is played by the Indian actor called Fema. And I'm sorry, I always laugh when I say this. His father's name is Gobi, which, if you know Urdu, means cauliflower. And he's supposed to play a Palestinian, so you got an Indian guy playing a Palestinian who's named after, like, if you go to any Indian restaurant, olive oil, potatoes, and cauliflower. I think that's an inside joke. I think they knew that, and it's just making fun there, which I quite like. Canada, that I mentioned, had this show that ran for 6 seasons. Little Mosque on the Prairie, starting in 2006. It's now available. You can get it on YouTube. You can get it on Hulu as Little Mosque. I think the Laura Ingalls people sued the Little House on the Prairie kind of thing. I'm not sure if that's actually the case or not. But so it's Little Mosque on Hulu. It's on YouTube. And this was Zarqa Nawaz, who was a Muslim who created this show. And it ran for 6 years on CBC, Canadian Public Broadcasting. She based the show on her own experiences of moving from Toronto to Regina, moving from the big city to the small town, moving from a large Muslim community to the small Muslim community. So it's much about, country mouse, city mouse, as it was about Islam. It also had a Muslim actor, the guy playing the Imam, Zaid Sheikh, true story. Zaid Sheikh, the actor that played the Imam in his role, is now the Canadian Consul General in Los Angeles. I love that. Who are you going to appoint as the Consul General in LA? That's appointing an actor. The fact that he is now the Canadian Consul General, I think, is just delightful there. But this happened because you got a Muslim creator, Zarqa Nawaz. You got a Muslim actor who can nuance some of the portrayals, and I think that's really important. In this show, you see the diversity of Muslim communities. There's vibrant Muslim communities in small towns in Alberta, in Manitoba. One of the oldest Muslim communities is in Lac La Biche, in Alberta. The oldest mosque in Canada is in Edmonton, founded in 1938. And you see the diversity, of Muslims in Canada: African Muslims, Arab Muslims, South Asian Muslims, Canadian-born Muslims, immigrants. I love that. Let me just conclude here by saying some things about Muslims being involved in the stories that are told about us, and my own brief role in some of that storytelling. If you remember, I'm sorry, I'm a pro wrestling fan, between Andy Kaufman and Jerry the King Lawler, the I'm from Hollywood, I have the brains, this classic portrayal about what Andy Kaufman was doing here. So in 2007, I was contacted by the offices of Nancy Miller, who was the creator for a new show that had gotten a pilot but hadn't yet been greenlit for the seasons, and it ended up being approved for 3 seasons on TNT, Saving Grace, with Holly Hunter. The main character, played by Holly Hunter, was Grace Hanadarko, who was a police detective in Oklahoma City, whose family members were killed in the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in 1995, a crime originally thought to have been committed by Muslims, but actually by Christian white supremacists. In the show, there's a character named Leon Cooley, played by Bokeem Woodbine, who converts to Islam while in prison. Something that still happens. The theme show for this series was sung by Everlasting, American hip hop artist. It was a real delight to be able to work on this show and to help in the creation of positive Muslim images. Leon, the Bokeem Woodbine character, to take one example, was about to kill a prison guard who brutalized him, was talked out of it by his last chance angel. The show centered around Holly Hunter and Leon Ripley's character Earl, who was like an angel that was sort of following her and some other characters. And Earl basically tells Leon he can't get to heaven as a murderer. And the writers, I worked with writers on this, wrote a lovely, lovely bit where Leon converts to Islam. And he thinks that when he converts to Islam, he's going to lose his relationship with Earl, his guardian angel. Because, of course, only Christians have angels and only angels are Christian. Leon makes the Shahada, their witness, there's no God but God, the conversion to Islam, opens his eyes, and there's Earl, who greets him with Salam Alaikum, reminded that angels are not Christian Muslim, they're angels, there. What was really touching, though, was there's an episode in which one of the characters' brothers is killed in the war in Iraq. And on the fictional television show, we were able to show the flag-draped coffins of U.S. soldiers coming home from burial. It was astonishing to me that on a fictionalized television show, we could show those images. The real news weren't showing those images. In 2015, I was asked to be a consultant on The Story of God with Morgan Freeman, which premiered in 2016 and ran for 3 seasons. The show was created by Mr. Freeman, his producing partner, Laurie McCreary, through their productions company, Revelations Entertainment. I shared the story this morning on the radio show about the creation of the show. Mr. Freeman was in Turkey shooting a film on a day off, gets a tour of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. And he asked the tour guide, wait, you told me that this was built as a Byzantine church? Yes, sir. But then you said the Muslims conquered this. Yes. Well, why is there this image of Jesus and Mary in the ceiling? And the tour guide says, well, Mr. Freeman, Jesus and Mary are important to Muslims. And he said, oh, I did not know that. And if I don't know that, and that's a basic fact about Islam, what else don't I know? So he started to do this show, I think, for his own religious education. I was able to offer a couple of suggestions for episodes. We did this episode in the second season, Proof of God, where we highlighted the work of Muhammad Zakaria on the left, this extraordinary calligrapher, one of the best calligraphers in the Muslim world, certainly the best American Muslim calligrapher. And we shot this. This is shot at the Islamic Center in Washington, D.C. He was the one that did the calligraphy for the Eid stamp, as part of the Postal Service's holiday collection. And that was really powerful there. We were able to have Mr. Freeman and Laurie McCreary, the blonde woman, as writing partner. They were able to come to LMU. It was one of these great moments of, the second season where they're doing the promo tours. I'm working in my office and I get this phone call like, hey, there's a whole Mr. Freeman schedule. Would you like him to come to your university to give a talk? I'm like, yeah, I would very much like to have him come. I didn't know where I was going to put him, how I was going to do it, what I was going to do, but you don't turn down that kind of offer. So this lovely opportunity there. They meaning Revelations. Mr. Freeman and Morgan McCreary's production company do Madam Secretary. Great show with Tia Leone. Barbara Hall was the woman who created that show. Having watched Hillary Clinton get questioned about Benghazi and realizing 2 things. One is we've had 3 women as secretaries of the state. Condoleezza Rice, Madeleine Albright, Hillary Clinton. And then, what's it like to have that be your work life? How do you come home? What do you talk about at home when this is your work life? So this episode, Protocol, season 4, episode 21, is actually done based on an iftar dinner. There's a really interesting thing with a Muslim country. It's sort of playing about what's happening in Turkey, but not actually saying what's happening in Turkey. So this is a great example of how do you get it right? you do it with sensitivity. Many of you know Hassan Minhaj, the correspondent from the Daily Show. 2017 did this special Homecoming King. Since 2018, his own show, Patriot Act. Mahershala Ali in 2017 became the first Muslim to win an Oscar for his Best Supporting Role in Moonlight in 2016. Now, I was talking about this with the Imam Ilyas and some of the other brothers. Mahershala Ali is an Ahmadiyya Muslim, a small sect of Islam. And he's talked about this, that the only reason he joined the Ahmadiyya community was because he originally went to a Sunni mosque and the brothers just treated him horribly when he was trying to pray. He didn't know what he was doing, clearly didn't know what he was doing. And rather than trying to correct him in a gentle way, people were, no, you can't do this, you can't do this, how can you, he just left. Months later, God walked through a different mosque because he genuinely wanted to learn about Islam. And the Ahmadiyya community welcomed him. That's why he joined that community. You think about that. In 2019, he won his second Best Supporting Oscar for his role in Green Book. That slide's not supposed to be there. I think that's just there to show my street cred. The fact that in LA, we all know famous people and actors. We actually had a lovely event for Mahershala after he won his first Oscar, at City Hall there. Camille Nanjiani, 2017, I'll end here with a couple images. The Big Sick, really interesting, where he deals with issues of Islamophobia from his in-laws. It's about his own relationship as a Pakistani, as a Pakistani Muslim, marrying a white Christian woman there. And it was interesting because the family's played by Ray Romano and Holly Hunter. So you had Holly doing that, this really interesting role. Aziz Ansari won a number of awards for Master of None. In 2019, you had Rami Youssef with his own show on Hulu. It's really been quite well received as an Egyptian Muslim, talking about some of the realities of Muslim life in America. And let me end here with sort of a plea to the Muslims in the audience. Relatively few of us Muslims are involved in the film industry. Until we become more involved in television and film, we leave the telling of our stories to others. As such, while we can and should protest against inaccurate depictions, we also can't expect others to tell our stories the way we would like them to be told. I say this all the time. Muslim mothers or Jewish mothers. There are 4 possible careers you can have. You can be a doctor, lawyer, engineer, business owner, and there is no 5th option. My mother to this day is, Beta, you're so smart, you could be a doctor. Mom, I am a doctor, I have a PhD. No, Beta, a real doctor. The kind that helps people. I'm not saying we don't want Muslim doctors, lawyers, engineers. Nothing wrong with Muslim doctors, lawyers, engineers. What I'm saying is, we need some Muslim writers, some storytellers, some actors, some journalists, some filmmakers. Because again, if we don't tell our stories, other people are all too happy to tell those stories for us. I end with my favorite, it's not a Muslim, Jimmy Baldwin, extraordinary writer, cultural critic, ended a famous letter to his nephew with the following words. He was writing about race, but I think the lines that he was writing are applicable to religion now. Unfortunately, still applicable to race, 60 years after Jimmy first wrote them. This is from The Fire Next Time. I've assigned The Fire Next Time the last couple of years. My students realize that I'm old. I'm older than their parents. But this book was written before I was born, and writing about things in 1963 that are still relevant, unfortunately, in 2022. And this is what Jimmy writes in The Fire Next Time, and I conclude with this. But these men, Jimmy wrote, are your brothers. You're lost without your brothers. And if the word integration means anything, this is what it means. That we with love shall force our brethren to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality, begin to change it. For this is your home, my friend. Do not be driven from it. Great men have done great things here and will again, and we can make America what America must become. We, as Muslims, as American Muslims, must help in the construction of an America where our stories are told for what they are, part of the fabric of this nation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hussain. We have roughly 15 minutes for Q&A. So if you have any questions or comments, yes. If you just speak louder, please.
So I'm not the best looking guy in the audience, but I always felt that you made a good point that Muslims have to take care of things and tell their stories. Talking about your talking a speech about film industry and that. Without any disrespect to our guests and our audience, that I find film industry is kind of a slippery slope. So, I mean, it's kind of a challenging you see in Muslim faith and that type of thing, cultural background. How do you suggest that we take the first step?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So some of it is, what are our various cultural backgrounds? I happen to come from South Asian background. So a film that I loved 2 years ago, just before the pandemic, Grinder Chadha did this great film. You may know her as the director of Bend It Like Beckham, this wonderful sort of coming of age story about a Sikh woman. She did a film called Blinded by the Light about this young Pakistani guy in England. And I love that film because it's exactly that sense of, what's it like to be a young Pakistani growing up in England in like the third term of Mrs. Thatcher's prime ministership and some of the things happening there. If you're an Arab, Rami Youssef's thing I think is really sort of interesting. If you're African American, some other kinds of things there. But I think part of it is, film is such a powerful medium. We can tell the kinds of stories that we want to tell about who we are. And so, for example, and some of it is documentaries. Some of those are feature films. Like one of the films I use in my religion film class is this great film called Le Grand Voyage, which is this really interesting European film about basically a road trip between a father and a son to the Hajj in Mecca. And I think it was actually like the first commercial, like non-documentary film that the authorities allowed to be shot actually during the Hajj. And so you get this really interesting portrayal about this father and son's journey towards the Hajj. So there you've got a classic, wonderful Islamic, kind of film there. I was talking about someone else, the issues that my Muslim friends who are actors deal with exactly the same issue that my Latino or my Black friends deal with. Look, I can play terrorist number 2 on this drama and get $50,000, or I can not play terrorist number 2 and not to reinforce that, but $50,000 will pay for my kid's education, kind of thing. And so you're stuck with those kinds of things. But absolutely, do you have the kinds of entertainment that we do it? And we look, across the Muslim world, whether we're talking about like in India, Pakistan, whether we're talking about Egypt, whether we're talking about Iran, films, are made like I would say that Egypt is a fairly conservative Muslim country, and yet they make some amazing films there. And one more thing, and I'll stop here, is that whenever I speak to folks in the industry in Hollywood, I always say, look, I'm not asking you to have the Muslim be a hero. I would like it if you had the Muslim hero as a theology professor. That would be really cool. That's not going to happen. If you're going to do a TV show about doctors, have a Muslim doctor, because guess what? There's some Muslim doctors. That's why I love that community. It's a school at a university. Have some Muslims, because you got some Muslim students, some Muslim background. Have the lady at the Starbucks who runs the barista at Starbucks. Have her be a hijabi, because the lady at the Starbucks that I go to is a hijabi. Just have it as part of the ordinariness, of life rather than the exotic kind of thing. I think that's where it's really important. That's where you make those kinds of connections. That's what people see. Without getting into it, I think this is really where, I said this before, so my apologies to those who heard it. This is why I think America is so powerful. We're not just powerful because of our military, even though we have the most powerful military. We're not the most powerful country because of our economy, even though we have this powerful economy with US dollars that you can use around the world. Try using Egyptian pounds here, not going to go so well. You can use American dollars in Egypt. We're the most powerful country because of our culture. We produce films, television, You know, I remember like in the 80s going back to Pakistan, and the things that people wanted were like video cassettes of Dynasty, because that's what people were watching. You know, and so I think that's what I'm getting at. Like, you know, we produce this amazing culture. What if we had some Muslims involved in doing that, to be able to shape it in ways that were, you know, how do you say this, Joey, Islamically acceptable kinds of things.
Anyone else? Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Do you have any films or TV shows that you would recommend that are the, let's say, the proper approach to the Muslim perspective?
Thanks, that's a great question. So some of the things are documentaries. So post 9/11, like one of the few, this goes back to your question, one of the few Muslim production houses is Michael Wolff and Alex Cronmer's Unity Productions Foundation. So they were the ones that did like Muhammad Legacy of a Prophet. You know, wonderful kind of thing. You know, telling the story of the Prophet without depicting him. There's no Islamic issues. You know, they're having people. I was talking with Rabbi Dana about this. You know, Ruben Firestone's in that film. You know, he's one of the commentators. You have some really good people there. So that film. The contemporary documentary that I mentioned, the Muhammad Ali documentary that Ken Burns did, a good, I would say almost 3/4 of that documentary, half to 3/4, is about Ali's conversion to Nation of Islam, and then the shift from Nation of Islam to Sunni Islam, and where that went in. The film that I mentioned I used in my religion film class, Friedrich Chada's film, Blinded by the Light, this really, really interesting sort of film about this Pakistani Muslim kid sort of growing up there. Some of the episodes of Story of God, you know, with Morgan Freeman. In terms of some of the fictionalized stuff, you know, you can watch now Little Mosque on the Prairie on YouTube. You know, just those kinds of episodes that talk about some of the realities of American, and in this case Canadian, Muslim life, which I think are really, really powerful, you know, kinds of things there. I think those are the kinds of things that I would start with, and there's, you know, there's others that we can talk about, but I think, you know, as a start, those kinds of films become really powerful.
I have a question. So, you know, nowadays, younger kids, especially, you know, they are living in a virtual world. A lot of gaming going on. And your expertise is mostly in film and television, but a lot of kids get their exposure from video games.
Yeah.
Is there any work being done or people involved that can somehow bring this normalcy or normality to the, you know, portrayal of Muslims, especially in video games?
No, and that's it. Like, go back to the films. Like, there's Ridley Scott's Kingdom of Heaven is this really interesting film because it talks about, you know, the Crusades, and it's just one of these really interesting portrayals of Saladin done in a really good way. You know, Saladin, you know, who's typically portrayed in sort of negative ways. Ridley Scott, you know, changes that up. But to your point, you know, if you look at Assassin's Creed, if you look at some of those kinds of video games, you know, a lot of the sort of violence that happens, a lot of the, you know, the enemies being like Arabs and Muslims, you know, that kind of thing. So you see that. There's been a lot of work that's been done recently on religion in video games. So I say that because, like, I'm not so full disclosure, I'm not a gamer. I don't play video games. But my friends who do tell me that it's this immersive sort of reality. You're telling these stories. You're involved in this. You have like more people writing scripts for video games than you have like computer guys coding that. Because it really is that sense of, you know, here's the story. And so I think that becomes this really interesting opportunity of being able to tell things. Like, you know, there's been controversy, and I'm still on the fence about this. Go back to your question about films. As a kid who read science fiction, Frank Herbert's Dune was this really interesting thing that talked about stuff around the Arab world, the Muslim world, some Persian kinds of things. The original film that was really not very good. The Denis Villeneuve film that just came out is sort of interesting. They made some changes I don't like. There's some other kinds of things, but like that kind of thing where you talk about, you know, this world where things happen. Go back to your question, Syriana. You know, I did a panel discussion years ago with Stephen Gagin, who had won an Academy Award for Traffic, and based on that Academy Award for Traffic, was able to do this film, Syriana, with George Clooney, Matt Damon. It's a really great kind of film about oil and oil resources and the politics behind that, but also around some of the Muslim kinds of things. So I think those kinds of things, like, you know, are able to do like the immersive kinds of video games that engage in these kinds of stories that don't have the Muslim as the bad guy that you shoot, you know, but talk about those contributions, talk about things things. I mean, the documentaries that UPF does, Unity Productions Foundations, they've got some really great things like Islamic art, the mirror of the world, everything on Islamic calligraphy, but exactly that kind of idea about science and technology. Is there a way to learn about this? Is there a way that talks about, all the contributions that Muslims have made? Can you do that in a game to show people some reason? I think that's the sort of background and subtext that we need to be able to do.
Maybe one last question.
I don't know.
So you talked about the show in Canadian television and some shows in American television. Do you have examples? Because Muslims are part of the community in England, for example, or in Germany, or maybe in Holland or somewhere. Is there something going on in those countries?
Absolutely. I think maybe something different, and we were actually talking about this in the interview this morning. So that's one of the differences between, broadly speaking, like American Islam and European Islam. So two things. One is, what does it mean to be American? It depends, all sorts of things. Much more narrow definition of what it means to be English, or what it means to be French, or what it means to be German. Second thing, the American Muslim community is incredibly diverse. Quarter African American, a third South Asian, a third Middle Eastern. In Europe, much more ethnically homogeneous. So most of the Muslims in Britain tend to be, Pakistanis, Indians. Most of the Muslims in Germany tend to be Turks. Most of the Muslims in France tend to be North Africans. And so you have that kind of issue. That leads to a little more marginalization, of communities there. But there's some really wonderful films. So you look at a French film called La Haine, I Hate. That sounds like 25 years old now, but it sort of focuses on some of the stuff that's happening in some of the suburbs with these youth. And it's one young Jewish kid and one young Muslim kid and some of the issues that come up there. You look at films, there's some really wonderful films that are made in Germany, both by German directors and by Turkish directors, talking about, the role of Turks and guest workers. And that's one of those differences. Like, the fact that someone like me can become a U.S. citizen. If you're a Turkish guest worker, you're not going to become a German citizen. You don't have the same opportunity. So do you see yourself as part of the society if you're actually not able to be part of that society? And so Fatih Akin, for example, has done some really interesting films, about life as a Turk in Germany, which talks about not just the Muslim part, but all kinds of issues there. There's a British Chavez film, Blinded by the Light, is an American film done by Warner Brothers, but it's set in Britain. And so, you have really interesting things like Hanif Qureshi's My Son the Fanatic film, much older film, but it's about this, Pakistani cab driver whose son becomes, really quite conservative in a problematic way. And what drives the son to do this, without giving away the story, it's the fact that, the father has come from Pakistan, he's a cab driver, the son is born there, he thinks the son will be English. And the son's like, yeah, there's no way. Even though I was born here, even though I speak the language, I don't have the accent that you have, they're never going to accept me. And so you purposely, turn the other way. And so films like that talk about some of those kinds of realities. But absolutely, you see them across the European context. You see them in the I know we have to stop here. One of my favorite, I show it every chance I get. I don't know how it got past the censors in Iran, but one of my favorite Iranian films is a film called Marmalade, the Lizard. And it's like this guy who escapes from prison and is able to hide by going to a small town pretending to be the imam because they're waiting for a new imam. And so he pretends to be the imam. And he discovers that the religious establishment is much more corrupt than it ever was in prison. That he'd make a better living, as an imam than he would as a thief. I don't know who fell asleep in the censor board, who got fired for that, but they let that film go out, But so those kinds of things that talk about, this sort of, and again, you're talking about a Muslim country saying, yeah, let's talk about some of the issues, let's talk about some of the problems there.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you all, to Rabbi Dana, to Pastor Kara, to Pastor Susan, and so we said, if you're interested, tomorrow we'll be at the synagogue talking about Muslim Jewish connections. It's 10:30, and then Sunday for Shed Methodist Church talking about some Christian dialogue. And it will be, it's a different talk, we're always not the same talk. But thank you, Fatih, and thank you everyone for being here, I appreciate it.